There's a moment, and I've seen it maybe 3 times in my entire career, where everything in a room goes completely still. Not quiet still, like the air itself decides to hold its breath. I was standing at the back of Training Bay 7 on the afternoon it happened, holding a thermal cup of something that passed for coffee on Karath Station, watching 43 cadets run through their third rotation of the day. My name is Instructor Devin Holt. I've been teaching combat integration at the Interspecies Defense Academy for 11 years. Before that, I spent 8 years in the Human Expeditionary Corps, 2 deployments on the Outer Rim, and 1 very bad winter on a moon nobody's ever heard of. I've seen a lot. But I knew, the moment Cadet Yara Akaffer walked into that bay, and Threk Vaughn turned to look at her, I knew exactly what was going to happen. I just didn't stop it. People sometimes ask me about that. They ask if I feel guilty, if I should have stepped in earlier. I tell them the same thing every time. No, and I'd do it again. Let me back up a little because this story doesn't start with the fight. It starts about 3 weeks before, on the day Yara arrived. Karath Station isn't a glamorous posting. It orbits a gas giant in the Velan expanse, about 40 light minutes from the nearest inhabited world, and the station itself looks like someone welded 3 different ships together, and then forgot to paint any of it. The main hub is older than most of the species currently represented here. The corridors run narrow, and the gravity calibration in the eastern wing is slightly off, enough to make you feel like you're always walking uphill slightly. Newcomers notice it for about a day, then their bodies adjust, and then they stop noticing everything. That's kind of the point of Karath, actually. You adjust, or you leave. The academy itself occupies the central hub, 6 training bays, a simulation wing, a medical block, and a classroom complex that smells faintly of burned circuit board no matter what anyone does. We run 3 intake cohorts a year, 1 primary, 1 supplemental, and 1 emergency intake when the Outer Rim councils decide they need more trained personnel faster than the schedule allows. Yara Akaffer arrived on the supplemental intake, which meant she came in as a single addition to an already formed cohort. That's always the harder entry. The group already has its dynamics, its hierarchies, its inside jokes, and its quiet resentments. She came in on a Tuesday. Not that days of the week mean much in deep space, but we keep the Earth calendar for administrative purposes, and it was a Tuesday, carrying 1 standard issue kit bag and a small personal pack that had a patch on the shoulder strap. I noticed the patch because it was a faded rendition of the Lagos skyline. Small thing, personal thing. The kind of detail that tells you a person hasn't fully left home yet. She was 22, medium height. Lean in the way that people get when they train seriously but don't have reliable access to consistent nutrition. Her file said she'd spent a year on a civilian cargo vessel before applying to the academy, and before that she'd completed 2 years of mandatory civil service back on Earth. No combat background, no formal tactical training. She'd passed the entrance qualifications by the lowest acceptable margin. On paper, she wasn't impressive. I've learned not to read paper first. When I walked her to Training Bay 7 that first afternoon, she was quiet. Not nervous quiet, more like observing quiet, the kind where someone is taking in a lot of information and doesn't want to waste mental energy on talking. She watched the other cadets through the bay window. She noted the layout. She noticed the equipment racks without being told where they were. Good habits. You're entering a cohort that's been together for 6 weeks, I told her. There's a ranking structure already in place. You'll start at the bottom of it. That's not personal, it's procedural. You work up. She nodded once, understood. Any questions before I take you in? She was quiet for a second. Then, who's the one I should be careful around? I looked at her sideways. Most new cadets ask about the schedule or the facilities or how the ranking system works. She'd skipped all of that and gone straight to threat assessment. I didn't answer her directly. That would have been a disservice. She needed to see it herself, not take my word for it. But I made a mental note. This one paid attention. The cohort was a mixed group, as all of ours are. 12 humans out of 43 total cadets, the rest split across 8 other species. You had Velhari, who are tall and move with that unsettling fluid grace. A few Dren, stocky and almost comically serious at all times. 3 Palek cadets who communicated in tonal clusters and were still adapting their translation implants to human vocal registers. A pair of Suri who had come in together and were inseparable in the way that Suri tend to be. And 1 Karath, which was unusual. Karath don't often apply to integrated academies, and this one, whose designation translated roughly as something like 5th voice of the Western clan, went by the shortened human approximate name of Fiven. And then there was Threk Vaughn. Threk was Murath. If you've spent any time around the Murath, you already know something about how this story goes. If you haven't, here's what you need to understand. The Murath are a physically imposing species, roughly bipedal, standing about 2 heads taller than the average human, with dense muscle structure beneath scaled skin that ranges from deep gray to almost black. Their homeworld has significantly higher gravity than most inhabited planets, which means their bodies are built for force. A Murath in a fair fight against a human isn't a fight, it's an outcome. And Threk knew this. That was the thing. He knew it in the way that someone knows a fact they've chosen to make into a weapon. He wasn't the worst cadet I'd ever had. He trained hard, which I respected. He took instruction reasonably well in formal sessions. But in the informal moments, in the breaks, in the corridors, in the low supervision periods, he operated on a different set of rules. He had established in those first 6 weeks a kind of quiet dominance over the cohort, not through merit, through size and implied threat and the specific social language of someone who's learned that other people's discomfort is useful. The human cadets mostly kept clear of him. The Velhari tolerated him. The Dren didn't particularly care about social dynamics and just kept doing their work. The Palek cadets were genuinely uncertain how to read him. And the one cadet who had, in the 6 weeks before Yara arrived, clearly been the primary target of Threk's particular brand of attention, was a young man named Cadet Prize Olin, human, 19 years old, from a small agricultural settlement in what used to be called the Netherlands. He was a good cadet, conscientious, technically skilled, had excellent instincts in simulation scenarios. But he was also physically slight and had a kind of earnest quality to him that made him look permanently younger than his age. Threk had been picking at Prize for 6 weeks in that specific way that's hard to formally report, because nothing he did crossed a line that was technically defined. He'd accidentally knock Prize off balance during formation drills. He'd choose the station next to Prize in combat simulations, and then recalibrate the difficulty settings in ways that made Prize look slower than he was. He made comments, translated comments, which lose some specificity but none of their intent, that positioned Prize as the weakest element of the group. I had eyes on it. I always had eyes on it. But in 11 years of teaching at an interspecies academy, I've also learned that there's a difference between a situation that needs intervention and a situation that needs to play out. I was waiting for the right moment. The right moment came wearing a Lagos skyline patch on her kit bag. Yara's first week was unremarkable in the ways that mattered. She learned the layout of the station faster than most newcomers do. She established a polite but not overly warm rapport with the other human cadets. She was friendly with the Dren in the way that outsiders sometimes are, because the Dren's social bluntness is actually restful when you're navigating a complicated group dynamic. There's no performance required with a Dren. You say what you mean, and they say what they mean, and that's the whole transaction. She was careful around Threk, not afraid careful. There's a difference, and I watched her make the distinction. She didn't avoid him. She didn't position herself in obvious deference. She simply moved through the space around him with a particular kind of awareness, the way experienced sailors give the right amount of room to the parts of a ship that could take off a finger if you weren't paying attention. Smart, very smart. She noticed Prize on day 3, I think. She didn't say anything about it, didn't approach me or report anything or make a show of noticing. But I caught her watching the group dynamics during a free training block, and I saw the specific moment she put it together. The angle of her head, a small stillness that came over her. She'd answered her own question from day 1. Who should I be careful around? She'd found him. On day 6, during a team combat simulation, something happened that wasn't in the training script. The simulation was a standard corridor breach scenario. 4 cadet teams clearing a notional hostile environment, non-lethal training rounds, basic tactical communication exercise. Yara had been assigned to a team with Prize, a Velhari cadet named Eshin, and one of the Dren, whose name I will attempt to phonetically approximate as Cohen. Threk was in the adjacent team, running a parallel corridor. The simulation was 10 minutes in when Threk's team, accidentally, collapsed a partition wall between the 2 corridors. Station simulations have a lot of moving parts, and partition failures are not unheard of. They are also not usually accidental when Threk Vaughn is nearby. What it created was a scenario where Threk's team was now functionally in the same corridor as Yara's team, and in the scoring logic of the simulation, the 2 teams were now treating each other as competing for the same objective. Threk made his move toward Prize immediately. Not violently, again, everything was just on the comfortable side of the technical line, but physically, in a way that boxed Prize out of position and left him unable to advance to the objective. In simulation terms, this cost Prize's team the round. What Threk didn't account for was Yara. She didn't intervene with Prize. She didn't shout or make a scene. She simply moved, quick, quiet, precise, to the secondary objective that Threk's maneuver had inadvertently opened up, took it cleanly, and then in a move I had to watch the replay on twice to fully follow, she used the scoring system itself to lock Threk's team out of their primary objective. She won the simulation. Her team got the highest combined score of the day. Threk got the second lowest. In the debrief, he didn't say anything to her directly, but I watched his eyes track to her in a way I recognized. It was the particular look of someone making a decision. The tension built over the next week and a half in that specific slow-pressure way that I've come to recognize in cohorts with a dominant aggressor. Threk didn't make obvious moves. He adjusted. He recalculated. He started paying a different kind of attention to Yara, not dismissive anymore, but evaluating, sizing up. He also doubled his attention on Prize, which was, I think, a kind of redirection of frustration. If he couldn't immediately find a lever against Yara, he'd apply more pressure to the situation she'd inserted herself adjacent to. Prize, to his credit, was holding up. He'd noticed Yara's maneuver in the simulation, and something had shifted slightly in him. Not confidence exactly, more like the recognition that the situation had more variables than he'd thought. That was good. That was the kind of shift that sometimes makes the difference. I ran extra technical drills that week. Nothing unusual on paper, just standard curriculum rotation. But I structured the pairing in those drills specifically. I put Yara with different partners each day. I put her with Khan the Dren, whose physical strength is comparable to a Murath's in raw terms, and watched how she handled the differential. She adapted her approach completely, didn't try to match strength, worked angles and timing, was patient in a way that surprised Cohen. I put her with Eshin the Velhari, who is fast in a way that makes most humans look like they're moving in slow motion, and watched her not try to be fast, but instead make herself the fixed point that Eshin's speed had to account for. She was doing something that took most cadets years to learn if they learned it at all. She was figuring out what kind of problem she was for the person across from her. I also, on day 9 of her attendance, had a quiet word with Cadet Prize Olin. Not about Threk directly, about what he'd done with the secondary objective in the simulation. You saw it, I told him, before HFY got there. You'd identified the opening. He frowned. I didn't take it, though. I was occupied with. I know what you were occupied with. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying you saw it. That's real. That's yours. No one gets to take that. He was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. Small moments. You plant them and you water them and you don't know which ones grow. It happened on a Thursday. We'd finished the morning session. Weapons handling and maintenance. Dry, technical. The kind of morning that makes everyone a little tired and a little short-fused. The afternoon session wasn't until 1400 station time, which gave the cadets about 90 minutes of unstructured time. Most of them ate, rested, ran personal training if they had energy for it. Training Bay 7 had an open free-use policy during the unstructured period. Most cadets used it occasionally for individual practice. On this particular Thursday, there were 11 cadets in the bay when I arrived to begin setup for the afternoon session. I came in through the equipment room on the east side, which opens to the bay through a one-way observation panel. Standard installation, cadets know it's there, but they don't always think about it. I wasn't trying to observe unseen. I just happened to come in that way. Yara was on the practice mat in the northeast corner. She was running through a solo drill, the kind of repetitive movement pattern that looks almost like a slow dance from a distance, working through a defensive combination sequence. Nothing showy, just consistent, precise work. Prize was nearby, doing something with equipment calibration on one of the simulation stations. He had a tendency to tinker, which was one of his better qualities. 2 of the Palak cadets were in the far corner doing something I couldn't fully parse from distance. A Velhari named Sen was running a physical endurance rotation on the far side. Threk Vaughn came in about 4 minutes after I arrived. He had 2 Murath cohort members with him, not cadets here, I should clarify. They were part of the station's general Murath community, non-academy personnel who had some kind of social connection to Threk. This happened occasionally. Cadets brought friends into free-use periods, which was technically within the rules as long as station passes were current. I clocked them the moment they came through the main bay doors. Threk assessed the room in about 3 seconds. His gaze moved to Yara first, just for a moment, then to Prize. Then he walked toward the center of the bay, his 2 companions flanking him in the way that was just short of a formal escort. I put down the equipment I was carrying and stood very still. What happened next took maybe 4 minutes total. It felt longer. Threk moved toward Prize first. I think it was a test still, probing the edges of the new situation. He came up behind Prize at the calibration station and said something I couldn't fully hear, but I saw Prize's body tighten. He turned around. His hand stopped moving on the equipment panel. I could have stepped in right then. My hand was actually on the door latch of the equipment room. But Yara had already stopped her drill. She didn't move toward them immediately. She just stood very still about 15 meters away, and she looked at the situation with that same evaluating calm I'd noticed on her first day. And then she walked over. Not fast, not rushing. Just walked over in a direct line and stood about 3 meters from Threk. "Hey," she said, just that, "hey." Like she was greeting someone she'd seen on a corridor. Threk turned to look at her. His 2 companions shifted their weight. "Akafar," he said. He had a translator implant, all cross-species cadets do, but his Murath vocal register came through underneath the translation like subharmonics you feel in your chest more than hear. "You're interrupting something." "Don't think so," she said. "Prize is just doing maintenance. Pretty sure that's open to anyone in here." There was a pause. One of Threk's companions made a sound, a low Murath vocalization that doesn't have a clean translation, but communicates something in the range of amusement or dismissal. It was directed at Yara. Threk took a step toward her, not a fast movement, deliberate. He was measuring her reaction. She didn't move. He took another step, close now, inside what any species would recognize as a concerning proximity. He was using his size intentionally. The height difference was significant. He was basically standing over her. She looked up at him. "You've been watching too many movies about humans," she said. The room got quiet. Threk frowned. You can read Murath facial expressions fairly well once you've been around them long enough. "What?" "The slow approach, the size thing." She tilted her head slightly. "You've seen it work on other species. You think humans respond the same way." "Don't we?" he said. It came out more like a challenge than a question. "Depends on the human," she said. "What are you actually going to do right now?" "Because I'll tell you, whatever it is, the consequences start before you're done with the first move. That's something about us you might not have loaded into your calculations." Threk stared at her. Then he did something I genuinely hadn't expected him to do. He charged her. Not a sparring charge, he wasn't pulling anything. He came at her with the full weight of a Murath frame moving at combat speed, which is something I have personally seen knock over structural equipment in training scenarios. It's a terrifying thing to witness from across a room. The sound of it, the mass of it. I pushed through the equipment room door. I didn't make it 3 steps before I stopped. Because Yara wasn't there. She'd moved, and I've had 11 years to study movement, and I still can barely tell you exactly what she did. But she'd moved before the charge completed, and she'd moved in a way that used Threk's own trajectory, and Threk went past her. And then there was a sequence of events that lasted maybe 2 seconds that I am going to do my honest best to describe. She caught his forward arm at the wrist. She redirected his momentum into itself. And then Threk Vaughn, 200+ kilograms of Murath at full charge, was on the floor of Training Bay 7. The sound of it was enormous. The bay was absolutely silent. Threk's companions didn't move. I think they were genuinely processing what they'd just seen, because I was too, and I had more context than they did. Threk himself was very still for a moment. Then he started to push himself up. Yara had stepped back to a neutral distance. Her breathing was slightly elevated but controlled. She wasn't in a defensive posture, which was honestly the thing that I think hit Threk hardest. She wasn't scared. She wasn't preparing for the next move. She was just standing there, the same way she'd been standing before he charged. "I did 2 years on the Kaleo," she said. Her voice was calm, a little quiet. "Cargo vessel. Standard route between Earth and the outer belt. You know what the crew was like on that ship. You know what can happen in interstellar cargo transit when something goes wrong. I didn't come here because I didn't know what hard was." Threk had gotten to one knee. He was looking at her differently now, not with the evaluating look from before, something more complicated. "That move," he said finally, and his translator gave the words a flat delivery that probably didn't capture whatever his actual tone was. "Where did you learn that?" "A Velhari merchant sailor named Cousin Bright taught me when I was 19, she said. "She said humans have a bad habit of trying to match force with force when the real advantage is in the gap between forces. Said we're the only species she'd met that could learn to use it properly." A pause. "She was right," Yara said. Threk stood up fully. His companions were still not moving, watching him. He looked at Prize, who had not moved from where he'd been standing, and whose expression I honestly couldn't fully read from where I was. Then he looked at Yara again. "You're going to be a problem," Threk said. "Only for some people," she answered. And then Threk Vaughn walked out of Training Bay 7. His companions followed. The door hissed shut behind them. The bay held its silence for another few seconds. Then Sen, who had been watching from across the room and whose Velhari expressive register I'd gotten pretty good at reading over the years, made a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was the Velhari equivalent of a slow exhale, the sound they make when they've witnessed something they're going to be thinking about for a long time. One of the Palek cadets in the far corner made a sequence of tones. Prize Olin said nothing. He looked at Yara. She looked back. "You okay?" she asked, the same casual tone, like she was asking about the calibration he'd been working on. "Yeah," he said, then after a moment, "What was that?" She thought about it for a second. "Physics," she said finally, "and a favor I owe a merchant sailor who believed in humans before I believed in myself." I stood at the edge of the room for a moment longer. Then I walked to the center of the bay, put down the equipment I was carrying, and began setting up for the afternoon session. Nobody said anything about what had just happened. The cadets moved to positions, ran pre-session checks, settled into the familiar routine. Prize took his station, and I just noticed that he was standing slightly differently than he had been before. Some small adjustment in the set of his shoulders, hard to define, but real. When the session formally started, I ran them through a new drill I'd been planning to introduce the following week. I moved it up. It was a redirection drill. Focus on using an opponent's energy rather than countering it directly. Nobody asked why I'd changed the schedule. Later, after session, after the formal day had ended and the station had shifted into its quieter evening cycle, I was in my office running through training logs when there was a knock at the door. It was Yara. "Instructor Holt." "Cadet Akafer." "Come in." She sat down in the plain chair across from my desk, which most cadets use as if it might move, but she settled into it like she'd been sitting in chairs like it her whole life. "I'm guessing you were in the equipment room," she said. "I was." She nodded slowly. "Are you going to file a report?" I looked at her for a moment. Threk initiated physical contact without consent or training context. That's technically a reportable incident. But the reporting structure for interspecies physical altercations is specific. The initiating party carries primary categorization, and the defensive response has to be disproportionate to require additional notation. She waited. "Your response," I said carefully, "was not disproportionate." She let out a small breath through her nose. "I'm going to ask you something directly," I said, "and I'd like a direct answer." "All right. How long have you been able to do what you did in there?" She was quiet for a moment. "The specific technique, about 2 years since the Kaleo." "And the part before that, reading Threk, placing yourself in position before he moved, that's not a technique you learn in 2 years." A longer pause. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I've always been able to, I notice things. The way people position themselves, what they're about to do, I thought everyone did that." "They don't." "I know that now," she said. "Took me a while to figure out that it was unusual." I leaned back in my chair. "Why didn't you report Threk's behavior toward Prize?" "Because it would have made it worse for Prize," she said, without hesitation. "And the intervention today. He was going to escalate, I could see it. He'd made a decision about something in the last few days. Whatever Prize had been managing, it was about to stop being manageable." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'm not going to tell you I calculated all of it. I didn't. I saw what was happening and I moved." Where did the words come from? The speech about humans in movies. Something that might have been a smile crossed her face briefly. That was actually improvised. I was mostly thinking about how to position my feet. I looked at her for another long moment. "You know Threk isn't done," I said. "I know. He's going to recalibrate. He's going to study what happened. He might even try to practice that counter. Mureth don't quit easily. It's a cultural thing, not a character flaw." "I know that too. So what are you going to do?" She thought about it. Get better at the next 12 things he might try, she paused, and make sure Prize learns to do at least 4 of them himself. I nodded once. Dismissed Cadet Okafor. She stood, nodded back, and left. I sat there for a little while longer after she left, drinking the last of the cold coffee and thinking about the 11 years I'd spent in this room, in this chair, watching people figure out what they were made of. Most of them surprised me eventually. Some of them surprised me early. The ones who surprised me early were the ones I remembered. The weeks that followed were quieter than I'd expected, and louder in ways I hadn't predicted. Threk did exactly what I'd told Yara he would do. He pulled back from direct confrontation, stopped the corridor maneuvers, stopped the simulation interference. He started training harder in ways that were actually visible and measurable. He asked questions in session that he'd never asked before, specific, technical questions about weight transfer and momentum management and defensive positioning. He was studying. That was the thing I actually liked about Threk Vaughn, underneath everything else. When he decided something mattered, he committed to it completely. The problem had always been that what he decided mattered most was dominance for its own sake. If he could ever redirect that toward something worth building, he'd be one of the strongest cadets I'd trained. But that was a longer project. The cohort dynamics shifted in the weeks after. Prize Olin started working out differently. I gave him a specific physical program tailored to what would work for his build and his specific strengths, which were agility and tactical reading rather than force. He and Yara started training together in free periods, which was interesting to watch. She didn't try to teach him the Velhari technique directly. She helped him find his own version of the same principle, something that made sense for how he moved. Good instinct, good teaching. The Palek cadets, who had apparently been consulting their cultural archives on human behavior after the incident, started approaching Yara with what I could only interpret as a kind of respectful curiosity. They would come to her during breaks and present scenarios, translated through the tonal cluster system as something like, "What would a human do in this situation?" And she would answer them honestly, including, "I don't know," when she didn't know, which seemed to impress them significantly. I watched all of it. I adjusted sessions based on what I was seeing. I moved the redirection drills into permanent rotation. I introduced a new scenario design module that required cadets to plan defensive responses, accounting for the specific physical parameters of the species they might encounter. And I made one other change. I restructured the team assignments for the final cohort evaluations, so that the team leads were determined by demonstrated tactical performance rather than physical assessment scores. Under the new criteria, the highest performing team lead candidate in the cohort was Cadet Yara Okafor. The second highest was Cadet Prize Olin. Threk Vaughn was ranked 7th. He took the ranking without comment, which told me more about how far he'd come in those weeks than anything else could have. The final evaluation was a full bay scenario, all 43 cadets, a complex multi-objective simulation, running for 6 hours with no breaks. The kind of assessment that tells you not just what people can do, but who they are when they're tired and under pressure, and the elegant plans have fallen apart. I watched from the observation room. I won't give you a full account of the 6 hours, because the truth is it was complicated and technical, and most of the interesting parts would require a detailed simulation diagram to properly explain. But there was one moment I'll tell you about. 4 hours in, at a point where fatigue was starting to show on every team, and the simulation environment had been deliberately complicated by 3 cascading system failures that our tech team had programmed in advance, standard practice, designed to test adaptation, there was a crisis point. 2 teams had converged on the same objective point from opposite directions. In the simulation logic, this created a neutral standoff zone. The rules said both teams had to resolve the conflict before either could advance. One team was led by Yara, the other was led by Threk. They stood on opposite sides of the standoff marker for a moment. Two teams, two very different histories. The whole observation room got a little quieter. Then Threk looked at Yara and said something into the team comms that his whole team heard. "What do you see that I'm missing?" I sat forward. Yara was quiet for about 4 seconds. Then she said, "Eastern approach is still open. If your team takes it and we cover the 2 northern exits, we get both objectives and both teams advance. The simulation probably didn't account for that path because it's architecturally awkward." Threk considered it. "You're sure?" "Pretty sure," she said. "But you know the risk profile if I'm wrong. What do we do about the standoff marker?" "Step forward together at the same time," she said. "Simulation rules say a simultaneous advance resolves a standoff in a shared credit outcome." Pause. "Okay," said Threk Vaughn. They stepped forward together. The simulation logged. Standoff resolved, shared credit. Both teams advanced. Both took their objectives. The total combined score pushed the cohort to a final evaluation result that broke the previous record for that scenario by 11 points. When the sim ended and the bay lights came back to standard, I sat there in the observation room looking at the score display for a while. Then I picked up my comm and sent a note to the evaluation records team. "Cohort supplemental intake. Final assessment complete. Performance exceeded all projected benchmarks. Recommend cohort advancement with honors. Specific notation requested for Cadet Akafer, Y, and Cadet Vaughn, T. The former for consistent tactical innovation throughout residency. The latter for demonstrated capacity for adaptive recalibration." I sat back in my chair. Outside, through the observation window, I could see the cadets in the bay. They were loud now, the post-evaluation noise of people who have been working under pressure and are finally releasing it. I could see Prize laughing at something. I could see the Palak cadets doing their tonal cluster communication at what seemed like elevated intensity. I could see Sen's Velhari expressive indicators running into something adjacent to joy. I could see Threk standing with his own team, not separate from the celebration but at the edge of it, in the way of someone who's not quite figured out how to be fully in a group yet, but who's genuinely trying. And I could see Yara in the middle of all of it, talking to someone, then to someone else, that small and genuine presence that had walked in 3 weeks ago with a Lagos skyline patch on her bag and had, in the quiet, unremarkable way of someone who simply knows what they're doing, changed something in this room. People sometimes ask me what the best part of this job is. They expect me to say something about the training, the challenge, the interspecies complexity. And those things are real. I do love them. But what I always think about when someone asks me that is this. There are moments in this work where you get to watch someone teach a room full of people something that you couldn't have scheduled into a curriculum, something that doesn't come from a training manual. Something that comes from a person who showed up knowing what kind of problem she was, and knowing exactly what to do with it. Yara Akafer graduated with cohort honors, the first supplemental intake cadet in the program's 12-year history to do so. She went on to a field posting in the Outer Rim Coordination Division. The last report I saw on her, about 3 years after she left Karath, described her as operationally exceptional with a specific noted capacity for cross-species team integration. I read it and thought, yeah, I know. Threk Vaughn went to a border patrol posting, and by last account was consistently rated in the top performance tier for his region. I heard through a mutual contact that he'd specifically requested to work with a Velhari partner, citing something about wanting to understand the gap between forces better. I thought about a merchant sailor named Cousin Bright when I heard that. And Prize Olin Prize went into simulation design. He builds training scenarios now for academies across 3 systems. I'm told the scenarios are famously difficult to solve with force alone, and that they tend to reward cadets who are patient and who notice things other people miss. Every cohort is a story, but some cohorts are a lesson. And the lesson of this one was simple, if you were paying attention. When an alien bully looks at a human girl and decides he already knows what she is, he's made his first mistake. End of Part 1. Story 2. Humanity gave a final warning. The galaxy paid the price in flames. HFY Sci-Fi Story Full Script. Part 1. I want to tell you something that happened before the burning started. Something small. Something that most of the histories skip over because it doesn't fit into the narrative of inevitability that everyone reached for afterward. The easy story about violence begetting violence and the dangers of underestimating a species you don't fully understand. The thing they skip over is the warning. Not the final warning, I'll get to that. I mean the first one. The quiet one. The one that was delivered in a conference room on Neutral Station Mile on a Wednesday afternoon according to Earth Reckoning by a human diplomat named Eleanor Voss, who was 63 years old and wore her gray hair in a practical knot, and had spent 31 years working in interstellar mediation before she walked into that room. Nobody remembers Eleanor Voss. I do, I was there. My name doesn't matter. I was a junior attaché in the Human Delegacy's External Relations Office at the time, 3 years into my posting, young enough to still be impressed by the size of the conference rooms and old enough to have stopped being impressed by the people in them. I took notes. I carried documents. I arranged translation matrices and confirmed equipment schedules and refilled water containers and made sure the temperature settings accommodated the widest possible range of species comfort. I was background, but I was there. And I remember what Eleanor Voss said in that room on that Wednesday that nobody in the history reports has ever quite gotten right. Let me back up, because you need to understand what Mile was in those days. Neutral Station Mile was, and I use the past tense deliberately, the primary intersection point for diplomatic contact in what was then called the Inner Spiral Cooperative, a loose affiliation of 16 species and their respective territories occupying roughly 400 light-years of what we now call the Central Corridor. The station itself was a masterwork of diplomatic architecture, which is to say it was specifically designed to make everyone slightly uncomfortable in roughly equal measure. The gravity was a compromise between Velhari and Dren standards, which meant it was perfect for neither. The atmospheric composition was calibrated to a median that was breathable by 12 of the 16 member species without supplementation, and the remaining 4 wore light filtration masks that nobody pretended weren't a slight indignity. The humans had been full members of the Inner Spiral Cooperative for 7 years at the time of this story. 7 years. That context matters. The cooperative was 300 years old. Some of the member species had been part of it for 200 of those years. Humans had arrived on the interstellar stage approximately 40 years prior to the events I'm describing, had made contact with the cooperative delegation 14 years before this, and had spent the intervening 7 years in observer status before being formally admitted. 7 years of full membership. In cooperative terms, we were infants. In the social dynamics of the cooperative, we occupied the precise position of the new junior partner who everyone was still deciding how to categorize. Not dismissively, necessarily. Not with overt hostility in most cases. But with that particular species of condescension that doesn't think of itself as condescension. The kind that comes from scale and time, and the genuine belief that 3 centuries of institutional history makes you automatically wiser than the people who showed up last week. Most of the species in the cooperative had, in the preceding 7 years, developed a working theory of humanity, what we were, what we could do, how we fit into the existing framework.